The artist. Carmina Mora was a gifted artist who carried the guilt of her younger brother's death. Growing up in a rugged coastal village in southern Chile, she sketched the sublime landscapes of Patagonia. Sitting outside, she painted dramatic fords while feeding the crows nested in the tree next to her house. She grew up carrying the guilt of her mother's sudden departure. Her father blamed Carmina for her mother's abandonment, which added to her grief. She became the caretaker of Matthias, her little brother, despite still being a child herself. A year later, Carmina was painting with Matthias outside when the telephone rang. Her father remained in the yard, drinking his beer. Carmina rushed to the house to answer the phone and hung up a few seconds later. When she returned outside, Matthias was nowhere to be seen. She asked her father, but he had paid no attention to Matthias. She called her brother's name, looking for him everywhere. While searching, she saw a bright red coat floating on the narrow creek by the house, Matthias's jacket. She jumped into the creek and found him floating on the surface with vacant eyes, unblinking. He had fallen and drowned. Her scream tore the sky. Her father found Carmina sobbing on the creek shore, clutching her brother's body in her arms, surrounded by a murder of crows. Her father snatched Matthias' body away from her, and she cried until her voice broke. The following morning, the world was cloaked in darkness. Her father did not say a word, because he did not have to. Carmina knew it was all her fault. Months passed, yet her loss was as fresh as morning dew. Crippling with self-loath, she could no longer paint. Without Matthias, life had no meaning. On the bleak morning of Matthias's birthday, Carmina walked to a narrow bridge several blocks away from home. She was convinced that nothing could bring her relief. Her mother was gone, her brother was dead, and her father blamed her for it all. She was convinced that she had nothing to live for. Carmina walked to the railing of the bridge that stood over the turbulent river. Locals nicknamed the spot Death Leap. Charming. Several cars drove by Carmina, but none stopped. No one seemed to care. She climbed over the railings, and her legs wobbled as she stood on the lip of the bridge. She looked down, watching the fierce river smash into a giant boulder. She closed her eyes. See you soon, Matthias. Suddenly, a cacophony of caws filled the sky. Carmina opened her eyes and saw a black cloud of feathers flying towards her. The cloud split open and glossy black crows dove from the sky. One landed on her shoulder and stared intently into Carmina's eyes, as if peering into her soul. Her grip on the railing loosened, and the crow cawed raucously. Carmina stared at the crow, confused. Another crow landed on the railing. Then again. Soon a flock of crows, murder, were covering the railing of the bridge, staying close to her. She felt their heavy stare on her, calculative and enigmatic, as if they were assessing her. She looked down for a second, and a thunder of caws interrupted her dark impulse. The crows seemed to care about her well-being. As she dangled over the edge, with the wind blowing through her raven hair, Carmina felt akin to them. For the first time since Matthias had died, Carmina did not feel alone. She returned home, giving life another chance. The crows left, but Carmina suspected that if anything happened to her, they would return. Inspired by her ordeal, Carmina picked up a brush. In the weeks that followed, she painted her experience using dark ink to depict the death leap on the black cloud of feathers, the murder of crows that saved her life. The experience was transformative and launched her signature black ink surrealist art. After several years, some colour pierced the darkness, and this shift to medium expanded her art form. She painted large-scale murals on busy street corners, designed grandiose costumes, and recited militant poetry. Carmina's art displayed local, intimate tragedies on a large scale, making them impossible to ignore, and everywhere she performed, crows followed. Her performances grew bold and drew the attention of artists who found her style invigorating. She grew close to a group of painters who understood her iconoclastic vision. Her performances launched the large-scale surrealist movement, which became a phenomenon. Her renown grew enough to attract the commission of a multinational enterprise, the VAC label. Carmina investigated the group, discovering that they gifted art pieces to select disputable congressmen. VAC's commissioned artists seemed to disappear afterward. Determined to expose the group's link to corrupt politics, Carmina accepted Vac's commission. The following week, Carmina painted a giant mural on a cemetery columbarium, displaying the Vac label logo as a surrealist Grim Reaper harvesting the fields of Chilean families. She wore a theatrical dress as she painted, on which she had stitched a poem about political revolution. The piece sparked a radical debate about corruption. The controversy painted a target on Carmina's back. After receiving anonymous death threats, she took refuge in her father's house, bringing along her closest friends for safety. That night, a gang of masked gunmen broke into the house. They swiftly subdued Carmina and her friends, threw them into a van, and drove off. The following morning, a dry breeze blew sand on Carmina's face, awakening her. She was seated in a chair in the middle of the desert, with her legs tied and her hands handcuffed. Her friends were lying on the ground, tied up. A shadow fell over her. Carmina looked up. A man dressed in a long robe, with his face hidden in a dark robe, approached her. He pulled a silvery knife from his robe. He grabbed her hands and recited a hymn in an unfamiliar language. Carmina held his gaze. He paused and brought down his blade with a sudden blow. She cried in agony as her friends awoke to a terrible sight. Carmina's severed hands falling in the sand. The handcuffs followed, landing in a pool of blood. The hooded man smiled in satisfaction. "How are you going to paint now?" Carmina cursed and screamed at him, wriggling against the bonds on her legs. The man grabbed Carmina's chin. He spit in his face. She spit in his face, He grunted and pried her mouth open, pulling out her tongue. Carmina struggled against his hold. In a violent blow, he chopped off Carmina's tongue. She howled in anguish. The man wiped his blade on his robe, leaving a trail of blood. "How are you going to recite poems now?" Sorrow swelled in Carmina's chest, sharper than pain. Overwhelmed by uncontrollable rage, grief and loss overcame her senses. She had lost her little brother, and she had lost the only way to cope with such pain. Carmina screamed like on the day her brother died. Raucous caws echoed through the wasteland. The sky was obscured by a cyclone of dark clouds. Black feathers fell on Carmina's bleeding arms. She looked up and saw a torrent of crows erupting from the clouds. Diving on the hooded man as the ravenous crows pecked at his flesh mercilessly, Carmina smiled, watching her surrealist art coming to life. But her heart lurched with rage when she saw the crows move on to their next target, her friends on the ground. She screamed as waves of pain and guilt and fright overwhelmed her, but it was in vain. The ravenous crows were uncontrollable. Darkness fell over her eyes as her friends' agonizing screams grew more acute. Death was coming, and again it was her fault. A deep black fog engulfed her.